MOV002.
May I ask to everybody to have a seat, that we can start with the session. So we are all going to some minutes. So the first thing is the connection with Florida is in the process. What? Yeah. The connection with Florida is in the process of getting on stream. And so we start the session with the second speaker on the program, and which is Mrs. Ellen Brown, already there. So thank you for being ready. So she's chairwoman and president of the Public Banking Institute, nowhere from author of the book The Web of Debt, and the promoter of the ethical finance and banking, which is the main topic of our session with Lisa Anderson, then probably at the end of the session. So please have the floor. Thank you. Another technical assistant.
If I could use your mic, then I can.
It's not there.
Yeah, I know, but if I could use your mic, see if I go here.
Microphone.
Your microphone. Your portable. I'm going to speak on sustainable money for a sustainable economy. Obviously, what we have today is not sustainable. So I'm going to go into the history of money, what have been more sustainable systems in the past, how they got suppressed, and how we can get back to that sort of model today. Two competing monetary systems have vied for dominance for thousands of years. Money created publicly by banks and money lenders, and money created privately by money lenders or banks, and money created publicly by communities or governments. Money created privately has, at least in its origination, was commodity-based. In other words, it was gold or silver. The money lender had the gold or silver, and he lent it out. And then the money lenders started lending other people's gold and silver that they were keeping for sake of keeping their customers' gold and silver. So in that way, they actually expanded the money supply because it was double counted. It was both a deposit and it was circulating in the economy as a loan. And then they started issuing banknotes, supposedly backed by this commodity gold, but they quickly discovered they could issue up to 10 times as many banknotes as they had gold, because people only came for their gold 10% of the time. Money issued publicly, on the other hand, was not commodity-based. It was actually more of a mutual credit clearing system, what we're talking about today, what you have in a community currency system. But it was more of a national community credit clearing system. So that you often hear it said that gold is the most sustainable, oldest, and most long-lived money system ever devised, but that's not actually true. The oldest, most sustainable, most long-lived money systems ever devised were by the Sumerians and Egyptians, which lasted over 1,000 years each. The Sumerians, you could say 3,000, depending on how you calculate it. I got my data from Michael Hudson and Bernard Leotard, so in their two books. And the Sumerians did not use money as we know it at all. It was just a system of debits and credits and pricing. And the Egyptians had they used grain money, as did the Sumerians, food money. And so they had grain-backed banks where you could put in your deposit of grain, and you would get as a receipt this pottery that would have hieroglyphics on it, and that pottery did trade as if it were a form of money. But you didn't get interest for your deposit in this grain-backed bank. In fact, you had to pay interest because grain tended to rot over time, and because there was a storage fee. So it was only when money actually became a commodity, something valuable in itself, coins or paper banknotes, that it was able to be exploited, it was extractive, it became a tool of empire. It could be hoarded, manipulated, and lent at usurious interest rates. Silver and gold were, of all those commodities that the Sumerians, who then became the Babylonians, traded, silver and gold were the most practical because they didn't rot and because you could carry them around and trade them. But the problem with silver and gold is they also didn't grow, they weren't organic. So they didn't automatically create the interest to pay back the loan. And so the money lender would lend out 10 and take back 11, lend out 11, take back 12 and a half. There was nowhere to get the extra interest except to take it from someone else, or somebody had to go into debt, lose their property, wind up in debtor's prison or slavery. It was actually the leading cause of slavery. And so this was not only not sustainable, it was actually the cause of the demise of empires. They crumbled under the weight of debt. During the Middle Ages, the Italian bankers figured out how to advance credit. So the Italian economy was booming, and they needed more money in the system. So the Italian bankers created credit on their books, but they were still technically dealing in gold. So it was really just an overdraft in the account of their customers. And so they were still dealing with limited gold, and it was sleight of hand. And so they would periodically get in trouble, and this was taken very seriously. For example, there was one example of a banker who was beheaded in front of his bank because he was unable to balance his books, which is probably a good model. But I haven't followed today, but maybe we should. But this would cause, the economy to collapse and much trouble. So to overcome that, public banks were set up in some city-states, like the Bank of Venice had a public bank, and the Bank of Florence, etc. There were also public banks at the local level. These were devised by the churches and the monasteries for the poor people. The poor had nothing to post as collateral. I mean, they didn't have land, and there was no way they could pay the 60% or so that the moneylenders were charging. And so these mons pietatis, as they were called, lent to the poor at very reasonable interest or even no interest, and they evolved into the public banking systems that are still quite popular in Europe today. They're local, they're municipally owned, or they're community owned, or alternative type systems. In England, you had the moneylenders both competing with the tally system. In fact, the moneylenders were evicted in the 13th century because they were, the people were rioting because they had been fallen so far into debt to the moneylenders. And so for a period of 700 years, what they had as an alternative, the people's currency, was a tally system. It went from 1100 to 1834, and these were just sticks that were split in half with notches on them. So obviously they did not have value in themselves. They were just like the pottery of the Egyptians. They were basically receipts delivered by the government for goods and services given to the government, either in the payment of taxes or as an advance against the payment of taxes. And so they circulated in the community as a form of money, and they could be accepted in the payment of taxes. So again, they were a unit of account rather than a store of value. However, in the 17th century, the moneylenders were let back in when Oliver Cromwell needed money to fund his revolution. He was obviously not the king, so he couldn't print money. So he borrowed from Dutch moneylenders, and they were allowed to set up the Bank of England, which would then lend their paper banknotes, supposedly backed by gold, but they did issue many more notes than they had gold. And these notes then became the national currency, and the king did not actually have to pay off the debt, he just had to pay the interest. So in effect, the government was renting the currency from these private moneylenders. That competed in the American colonies with the American colonial scrip, which again was a government issued money paid for goods and services delivered to the the government. So it was basically just an accounting system. It was just a system of receipts. It was started in 1691 when the governor of Massachusetts needed money to fund a war, and he didn't have gold and he didn't have anyone to borrow from, so he got the idea that he would just issue these little receipts to the soldiers for their service, and then of course the community recognized that value had been given and that value was due, and then those receipts circulated in the community. They were supposedly an advance against taxes, but because the governors of the colonies were not elected, they were not representatives of the people resisted paying taxes. So the governors were a lot better at printing the money than at collecting it back in taxes. So some of the colonies did manage to hyperinflate their currencies. But there was a particularly sustainable system, and that was in Pennsylvania and other middle colonies, but it was developed to its full potential by the Pennsylvanians. They actually had a bank. So it was a land bank. The government would issue paper scrip and lend it into the economy, so then it would come back as principal and interest. And because they were the government, they could pay a little extra in interest. And so there was enough money out there to cover principal and interest. So for example, you could issue 105 units of this currency, lend 100 at 5% interest, spend 5 on your budget, and then there would be 105 out there, which would all come back as principal and interest. You could lend the 100 again, spend the 5 again, and it would all come back as principal and interest. You could do that over and over, and you didn't have to inflate your money supply in order to find the interest to cover principal and interest. And of course, the interest went back to the government, which was the people that funded the government. So it was a sustainable public system. But the merchants complained to the king about that they couldn't tell what they were dealing with in all these various community or colonial currencies competing with each other, and then some of them were hyperinflating. So the king forbade some of the colonies from issuing their own currency. And Benjamin Franklin then made the mistake of going to England and arguing the case for these currencies. And he said what a great thing it was. The colonies were prospering because they had their own currency, they had plenty of money to fund trade. And they were therefore becoming financially independent of England. And this, of course, did not please the Bank of England. In fact, they were quite alarmed, and they leaned on the king to forbade all the colonies to issue their own money, which they did. This created a depression because the money supply shrank, and so the colonies went back to issuing their own money, which was considered an act of rebellion, and the king sent in the redcoats, and we had the American Revolution. We won the revolution, but we lost the ability to print our own money for reasons I don't have time to go into. Abraham Lincoln restored the money issuing government created money system of the colonists during the Civil War because he didn't want to. The bankers would lend to him only at usurious interest rates, 24 to 36%. And so to avoid that, he issued his own money, and that worked very well, won the war, and there was also an unusual period of expansion during that time. But he was assassinated, and that program was discontinued, and by 1913 we had the Federal Reserve, which is purportedly public, but largely private. I don't have time to go into that either. However, there were other ex-British colonies that did continue this credit-based currency system of government-issued credit. Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and it did work brilliantly well. And in each case, it was the Bank of England that managed to nip this practice in the bud. And the Commonwealth Bank of Australia funded all sorts of seaways, roadways, fruit companies, all sorts of productive things, including their participation in World War I, just by issuing the credit of the nation. They didn't borrow from anyone, it wasn't backed by anything, they just issued credit in the same way that the American colonists had done. Worked brilliantly well. The only problem was that Governor Denison Miller, who was head of the bank, made the mistake of going to the City of London and bragging about how independent they had become. And of course, this alarmed the Bank of England. He died shortly thereafter of a heart attack, and the Bank of England set up a new system where it was the central banking system that we have today, where rather than the Treasury issuing the national currency, it would be issued by a central bank, which would lend the money to the government and to the bankers. And so, the apex of this system would be the Bank of England. That word, the apex of the system, was actually used in a book of the 1930s that was describing this whole development. And the word was used again. The man that was sent in to reign in Australia and New Zealand was Sir Otto Niemeyer, who was a governor of the Bank of England. And he later became the head of the Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland. And the apex of the system also moved to the BIS. So the implication is it was the same system and just moved over more discreetly into Switzerland. In 1966, Carol Quigley wrote in Tragedy and Hope. He was a Georgetown University professor. He said he was groomed by the international bankers. He was an insider, and he was supposedly their librarian. And so he had all this 900 pages worth of data, which they wanted to keep quiet, but he thought that it should be published. So he put it in a book, which was quickly suppressed. But in it, he said, "The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole." The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury funds. So that's the system we have today, and that was set up intentionally by this whole banking parasitic elite, and that is what has happened to these more sustainable systems. It wasn't that they hyperinflated and died of their own accord. They were suppressed. They were intentionally suppressed. In New Zealand, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand was set up by Otto Niemeyer, but some social creditors got into power. C.H. Douglas had visited in Australia and New Zealand and in Canada and Japan and had quite an effect. So these were social creditors who set up a system where they used the bank to issue national credit, and they funded low-cost housing and various things. They got it because they could keep the interest, because they owned the bank. That cut the cost of projects in half, so it made projects that would otherwise be unsustainable quite sustainable. That worked until the Bank of England sent their emissary who threatened to cut them off from trade with the Commonwealth if they did not cease these unsound practices, which they then did. But they had no control over Japan or Germany, which also did this system of just issuing the credit of the nation without borrowing from the international bankers. But they were stopped by war. Meanwhile, Canada was carrying on with the system. Their Bank of Canada was set up in 1935. So from 1939 to 1974, they issued credit to the government, interest-free because they owned the bank. And during that time, they funded all sorts of remarkable things, including pensions, their participation in World War II, the Trans-Canada Highway, the St. Lawrence Seaway Project, and a quite excellent system of healthcare. It's not so good today because they are now in debt. But when it was first set up, it was done with this national credit. In 1974, they quit this practice and started borrowing on the private bond market, and that's when their debt shot up. And so today it's quite high. So why did they cease that practice? In 1974, the Basel Committee was set up by the central bank governors of the group of 10 countries of the BIS, and Canada joined in that year. And the goal of the Basel Committee was to maintain the stability of the currency, and basically what that meant was you couldn't inflate your currency, supposedly, by printing money or by borrowing from your own central bank, which printed money. You had to borrow on the private market. But so the implication of that was that when you borrow privately, you're borrowing existing money. But as we know, virtually all money is created by banks in the form of loans. They actually create money when they lend. The difference is that when a private bank lends the money to the government, they charge interest, and when the government borrows from its own central bank, it gets the interest back. And the problem with the whole interest system is that the banks create the principal, but they don't create the interest. So there's nowhere to get the interest except to borrow from somebody else, or for somebody else to go into debt. So you have this giant pyramid scheme where it takes more and more debt to sustain the system until it finally collapses. Obviously unsustainable. This is a chart that was put out by a group that was arguing that Medicare and Social Security, the entitlements, so-called entitlements, are what are killing us. But you can see that what is killing us is actually the interest. It's that big yellow triangle at the top. If we eliminated the interest, the federal debt would actually be quite sustainable. In fact, as we previously argued here, we might not have a federal debt if we eliminated interest. And you can eliminate interest by borrowing from your own bank, and then you get the interest back. So borrowing from your own central bank. Right? Okay. The French, since 1973, have borrowed as much, or paid as much in interest as their debt is. So if they hadn't had to pay interest, they would have no debt. The Canadians have paid twice as much in interest as the debt now is, so they would have a nice surplus if they hadn't had to pay interest. In the U.S., the Federal Reserve only reports 24 years, but in the last 24 years, we taxpayers have paid $8.2 trillion in interest out of what was then a $15 trillion debt. So if you go all the way back to 1835, when the last time the debt was paid off, we might also not have a federal debt at all. We could, like the American colonists, eliminate income taxes if banking were a public utility, but I don't have time to go into the figures. Local governments could do the same thing. Even though they don't have the power to create money, they do have the power to have their own bank. If they borrowed from their own bank, they could borrow interest-free, and as Margaret Kennedy has argued, that means cutting the cost of your public projects by an average of 40%. We have but one bank that does that, one state that does this, North Dakota. The bank in North Dakota was set up in 1919. It's the only state that escaped the credit crisis. It has the lowest unemployment rate in the country, the lowest foreclosure rate, and the lowest default rate on loans. But that's only one state. However, if you look globally, 40% of banks globally are publicly owned. And these are largely in the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, which also contain 40% of the global population. And those countries also escaped the credit crisis. They also have most of the global reserves, and they're not happy with the current reserve system under the US dollar. They want something else. In fact, they want the Chinese proposed going back to Keynes's idea, which was basically a mutual credit clearing system, an international currency union, where you'd be clearing trade balances not through somebody's reserve currency, but just by figuring out credits and debits. But then the question is, what would they use for a currency unit? Keynes proposed something called the banker, which would be based on a basket of commodities. Ross Jackson wrote a book called Occupy Wall Street, where he said that the problem with the basket of commodities is that commodities all rise and fall together, so it's not really a true measure of the value of the currency. Plus, it's really not relevant to what people need, goods and services that people actually use. Most people don't buy silver and gold. So he proposed a basket of currencies, but it seems to me that a basket of currencies is also sort of in flux. They're all valued against each other, so you still have this fluctuating ocean of prices. That's the reason we have this $1.5 quadrillion derivatives bubble, because everybody's trying to create some stability in this floating sea of exchange rates and interest rates and things that just aren't stable. Unlike the Sumerians, who fixed their interest rates for hundreds of years and fixed their prices for hundreds of years at a time. So then another possibility is green energy units, which has been discussed here. It seems to me the problem with that is that it is basically a commodity, even though it's a better commodity than gold, but it just seems to be a bit limiting. It's not, doesn't really reflect the value of the currency. Another possibility is a consumer price index, but those are a bit manipulated. And there are also indexes based on purchasing power parity that are quite sophisticated now. It seems to me that those might be the ideal measure of the value of the currency, a way to compare, to have a yardstick comparing the relative value of currencies that's not based on international speculation, that eliminates all those other factors that aren't relevant to the actual value of what the currency can buy in the economy. So if we did all that, we would be back to the mutual credit clearing system of the ancient Sumerians. And if credit were made a public utility, then interest and profits would go back to the public, and banking would become a sustainable system.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and particularly for the historical overview. It's very, let's say, interesting to realize that at one time, at one hand, money has an old history, and secondly, the movements along history and our recent history. So, in particular, the colonial period you have mentioned from the UK and so forth. So thank you very much for that. So I got the information. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, well, please, yeah. That Asa Anderson will be online in some 3/4 of an hour or somewhat less. So we have time to shift your presentation to Professor Hödel. Introducing him is well known as Professor of Economy, has been director of the University of Wuppertal and of and as well as among others, Vice President of the European Academy for Sciences and Arts in Salzburg. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have been asked to give some critical views on the concepts which are to be discussed today and tomorrow. And I must confess that the critical view will not be very strong on those concepts discussed here, with which I am a bit familiar. For example, from the book of Stefan Brunhuber and other publications. So, for this reason, I will switch mainly on the global financial system, and here especially the role of the dollar, which is the unipolar currency system which dominates all national and continental currency systems, and my target will be that we have to switch from a unipolar currency system existing now and having been also in the 19th century anchored by the pound, the British pound, which is now the US dollar. We have to switch in a multipolar system, and then we get room also for regional or smaller complementary currency system, which otherwise would be, in most cases, be destroyed by the existing unipolar currency system. This is my thesis, and I will elaborate it a bit, starting from the fact that the existing unipolar financial market system is not only dominated by the US dollar, but it is also taken over by the European system of the euro, so that the cooperation between the US system and the European system is quite narrow, and they are both playing each other, but there is a predominance of the US currency system over the European system, which means that what happens actually in Europe is mainly the result of the system in the United States, and by dominating all global financial markets, the world financial system. So this is a critical view, because in many publications Europeans are criticized for not repairing their system without referring in most cases to the fact that the overswapping of the problems in the United States to Europe are really the background of the existing difficulties both in the private sector and in the state sector. So what results out of this, if we go to the multipolarity, is that Europe has to go out from a junior partnership with the dollar and to develop, if possible, and this will not be easy, to develop the European currency system going far beyond to the existing, for example, the banking union, which is discussed now, but also the role of the national debt management and private banking management and so on. So the US model has come to the European economy not only in the financial sphere, but also in the state debt management, and additionally also in the private sector, in the productive sector. We have the well-known financial steering of productive activities also in Europe, which is usual and adequate for the United States. So we had to go out more or less to be one counterpart in the multipolarity system in the future, and I will later on refer to Japan and to China. So the origins of the existing global financial system comes out from the Bretton Woods system, where the United States has very much contributed to the reconstruction of Europe, and Europe's have to be very grateful for this help after the Second World War, which was also the advantage for the United States for creating jobs for the soldiers coming back in the United States, because the demand resulting from Europe, from the help, the Marshall Plan mainly, the demand for US products was a very important help also for the United States, both for Europe. So it was the transatlantic cooperation which was very well functioning. This is more or less the Keynesian idea that demand should be created by money, and as Europeans didn't have any money because of the war, the help from the United States was creating demand not only for the United States but also within Europe. And this cooperation has been and has ended in the year of 71, 73, when the Americans finished the gold standard, which was the obligation that the trade surplus of the European states resulted to a demand of gold in the United States. We have, from the beginning of the 60s, we have a trade surplus between Europe and the United States. And Europe wanted to refill their banks with gold coming from the surplus, external trade surpluses. And the European banks demanded too much gold from the United States, so the gold standard, the fixing of the demand on the quantity of gold has to be finished. So, and this Bretton Woods II system, which was established mainly in '73 on a global level, is not more adequate for the recent situation, for many reasons. Because the Bretton Woods system 2 actually reigning all over the Europe and all over the world is based on monetarism. Monetarism was resulting from the fact that the Keynesian policy in the United States in the Kennedy era resulted in more and more state debts, and these state debts had to be restrained, and the state debts couldn't be reduced for the reason because there were many wars. You should remember many wars in the 60s and 70s, and to restrain the debts, the public debts in the United States, one has to go into creating money, and money creating was the basic concept for the monetarism, which later on was combined with neoliberalism. Everything was regulated by the markets, both on the financial side and the real side. And the result, I will give two examples, was that the difficulties of the United States resulted in an economic conflict, first with Japan, and second with Europe now. So first, the conflict between Japan and the United States was that the Japan economy wanted to gain global leadership, and this was made by export surpluses now in the United States, and also by growing direct investments in the Western industrial world. The Clinton administration in the 90s tried to have some arrangement with the United States, between the United States and Japan, but they didn't succeed because the Japanese thought they are stronger than the Americans. And in fact, they was also the coming superpower, or by some regarded as the coming superpower. So the United States had to use the financial weapon to tame the aggressive export strategy of the United States. And this was made by devaluating the exchange rates, so that the exports, which were very large in favor of the Japan economy, the surpluses were invested within the Japanese economy, with the result that the shares were growing very much in prices, and especially the immobilian in Japan. But when the export didn't bring so much money as expected before. Everything broke down in the Japanese economy, and the Japanese economy in the 96-7 broke down and couldn't recover until now. So the conflict in the monetary system between the two nations was in favor of the United States, but at the disadvantage of Japan, and the position of the United States could be restored. The Japanese, they are trying to have their own model, but they are not succeeding in this competition. It was mainly the Federal Reserve System which controlled the exchange rate, and one can say that the Federal Reserve System was the main actor to fight within this competition, and the result was, in any case, not for the Japans, but for the United States. So what is the lesson out of it? If you have a system which is unipolar, and one of the competitors is trying to fight this system, he can be tamed by the financial activities, mainly by the central bank, whatever the central bank is. A system which is unipolar is always in a position to tame all competitors. So this experience is made, and one must always say it's not the will of the United States, but they have, as being the first currency, they have to act like this, also if this is advantage at the disadvantage of the international economic system. So this is one example. And what is actually more interesting maybe is what happened with the European Union and the European financial system. We had in Europe the idea at the end of the 90s, after the Japan crisis, the Europeans had the idea to be the most competitive economy, knowledge-based economy was the term of the European Commission, to be in the world. So then they started the Lisbon strategy in 2000, and the background of this strategy and the idea of the Europeans to be the first nation globally was the weakness of the US dollar in the consequence of the Japan conflict, which was in favor of the United States, but the United States were weakened also from the consequences of the former Mexico crisis, which is another smaller conflict at the global level. So Europeans had about the same idea to be more competitive than the United States as 5 years before the Japanese had. So, and the fact was that the United States, the Federal Reserve Bank, has to take some measures to tame the European competition. In a unipolar system, you have always this same pattern of conflict, and what happened is aggravating the relation between the United States and Japan is that Europe has a very large saving surplus. And the saving surplus, after the currency introduction of the currency union, went first to the south of the European nations. It was in the first years of the last decade. And the second was the transfer of many savings to the United States where European banks bought bad papers. Everybody knows this relation was the housing crisis in the United States, and the papers were bundled and sold mainly to Europe. And when the bundling of these bad papers came out, it was mainly Europe which was hit by the crisis in the United States. The crisis of the United States was compared to Europe less than in Europe, and there are two lines in Europe which were especially hit. First, it was the banks, and as the banks have to be saved, it was the crisis of the public debts. So everybody knows that most of the help packages and the funds for the help packages went to saving the private banks. And the saving of private banks was immediately coupled with the difficulties, not only in the southern country of Europe, but mainly there. And the help package in the northern country of Europe are necessary to keep the balance for the banking system in the north of the European system. So what we can see here is that Europe failed this competition with the United States, and the reason is that everybody can still go into the unipolar dollar currency because there's no alternative. We have already about 65% of the investments, financial investments in dollars still. It's about 25 or 30% for the euro, not more. So the financial system is so strong that European cannot compete in any case, not comparable between the euro and the dollar. There is the strength of the dollar is much higher. So what is interesting in this, let us say, fight, is that the United States are forced to compete the competitors and to use the financial weapon, especially the exchange rate, to go out from these difficulties. So I will say now a few words about the theoretical foundations concerning the monetarism. What happens at the global level is a change from the Keynesian position to the monetaristic position, with the fact that monetarism is not looking anymore for real production. Monetarism is mainly the control of the quantity of money, and the control of the quantity of money is always regarded as the most effective device to have the financial markets very effectively, efficient. Several speakers have already spoken about efficiency and resilience. No, it's mainly efficiency, which is in the sense of the financial markets, it's efficiency. And as there's no view about the real production, the real production is lacking and investments are diminishing in the real sector, and at the same time the investments in the financial sphere are augmenting. So what we have then is the debt bubble, which results from the looking only on the monetary value, and real production is just a wanted but not propagated activity. For the United States, it's interesting that they have not so much invested in the real sector than in the financial sector, but everybody goes into the dollar, including the OPEC countries. We have an upstream flow of financial means down the dollar, also coming from the third countries. And this is enough to be strong. At the same time, in the United States, you have a very strong import surplus coming mainly from China. And this import surplus is above all ordinary products and commodities. For the lower people, and in this context, the American real investments are going mainly in high tech, and on this level, the United States are very competitive, but not on the broad lines of the spectrum of all commodities. So the surplus for the Chinese is a real consequence of the production structure in both countries. So what is the fight now, or the conflict on the financial market system, is between the US dollar and the Chinese currency. The Chinese currency is now making some coalition, and they are still at the beginning, with the Japanese currency, and they form some kind of coalition against the dollar, and the euro is behind the dollar but doesn't play a big role now. So the conflict is mainly between China and the United States, concerning not only the commodities but also the financial markets. And what I think is the only possible way to come out from these conflicts is some arrangement between the Chinese and the United States currency. And if this conflict is regulated in some orderly way without an economic war, which was called by Summers, the famous theoretician and advisor of the Clinton administration, he spoke of a war between the two countries. If we prevent this war and this conflict, we have to switch into a multipolar system, which consists of, I think, in the next decade, 4 currencies: the dollar, euro, renminbi, and yen. So these 4 should have a competition on the level of the financial markets between them, and if this competition, which is bound to devaluate the United States currency a bit, it will lose of importance, the others will gain, and this competition will give room for alternative systems, regional systems, which is the subject of this conference. So the main point is, if we have still a unipolar currency system, the implementation of alternative systems and complementary system is much more in danger than to have a multipolar system which gives room on the regional, sectoral and the smaller level, which I find could be a good combination between the global reorganization of the financial system and the regional and sectoral concepts which have been in the center of this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric, for your brushing the painting of our system, world system, and the situation at the end of the polymer. You used the word? Anyway, so the word is more complex than before. That you had a word, but it escapes. Multipolar. Voilà, there we have it. So a lot of things will happen probably in the next decades, 2 or 3 decades, and so I'm not so sure that China will be in the position or remain in the position it has today. But anyway, thank you very much for the painting. You have been brilliantly exposed. Now, you have the audio connection as well?
Yeah, hello.
Hello, you hear me?
I certainly do. Good afternoon.
Is that okay? Yeah.
Yeah?
Is it working? Yeah. Well, okay. So, dear Hazel, thank you very much for being with us. And you might remember, yeah, okay. You might remember that we met in Brussels at the European Parliament a few years ago. So anyway, thank you very much to be with us. Hazel Anderson is quite well known in the US, and as a futurist, an economist, and an iconoclast. I hope this is correct. A worldwide syndicate, columnist, consultant, etc., etc. So what I know is that you have been very interested in ethics in economy and in the financial world, and so this will be the topic of your presentation, as I understood. So to the audience, we will have questions and answers after your presentation. Yeah? Is that okay for you?
Really? Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, the questions are not only for you, but the other 2 speakers we have been advanced in the program. But anyway, so please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I need you to remove the chat box. Oh, there we go. So anyway, it's wonderful to be here in Split with you all, and to know that this is in honor of Nikola Tesla. And I studied his work many, many years ago when I was writing the book, which you see the cover behind me, called The Politics of the Solar Age. And I realized what a visionary he was in understanding that energy really is the basis of all life on this planet. And so just to remind ourselves how powerful the sun is, if we look at that big yellow box, that's the amount of photons coming in every day from the sun, at big box. And the little tiny orange box in the front is the global annual energy consumption of all human beings. So you can see we are awash in abundant solar energy and all of the other forms of energy driven by the sun: wind, biomass, geothermal, ocean and wave technologies, and hydro. And geothermal, of course, comes out of the Earth's crust itself. But so this energy transition is going to require a new currency. And that's why I'm so happy to be here today, because you have all realized that. And I like to think of the 3 modes of resource use for all countries are really information, matter, and energy. And of course, energy, rather information, is the most important because it dictates how well we use the matter and energy for our needs. And so for me, that has always meant an expanded framework for human policy. And the old economics in the middle is now being superseded, as you know, by general systems theory, by decision theory, game theory, and of course all enfolded by living systems theory and ecology. So this is really the approach that I take to my work. And so I have been critiquing for many, many years the economic model of development based on gross national product and pointing out that it didn't take into account all the social and environmental costs. So I have been arguing for many years for a net GDP, and at last we now are finding many new models, and this is very encouraging. Even deeper is that we humans are beginning to understand the role of money and other mediums of exchange. And this little diagram, as you know, we started off in the pre-industrial societies with money based on clay, tablets, and shells, and cattle, and metal tokens. And then the early industrial period, where silver and gold came in, and then the later industrial period, where the gold standard-based money was designed. But of course, it didn't work because there wasn't enough gold to back all of those currencies. And so today we have a crisis of fossil-fueled industrialism, which really crashed in 2008. And we realized that it was the crisis of a whole system, not just the fossil fuel energy, but also the floating fiat rate currencies. And so now we are going beyond those systems and realizing that we can design many new forms of currency. Some will be pure information-based trading systems, such as we're seeing now currencies simply like Bitcoin and Ben, which are purely digital currencies. But also, to peg a currency for international use, it will be very advisable to peg it to energy, to kilowatt hours, hopefully generate this electricity using solar and renewable resources. So let's remember that there always have been two ways of transacting. There has been the lower half of that diagram, the older traditional economies, which are based on cooperation, barter, mutual aid, pure information-based transactions. And we humans always love to trade and exchange with each other. And I have also drawn attention to the love economy, which in every society is all of those services and goods that we produce for each other without money. And today we're reaching the point where this unpaid economy, I believe now, is larger than the official money-based transactions, which are tracked by economic indicators like GDP. And of course, at the top there, you have the money-based transactions, which are going into crisis. The yen, the dollars, the euros, the pounds, etc., which are based on nothing, as we now know, but the faith that we have in our governments and our banks. So I see a planetary whole system shift happening, and it's accelerating due to all of these increased interconnections. And it's being driven also by the crises of global financialization based on the old fiat currencies. And of course, it's also breaking down because of the social and environmental impacts of this global industrial model and the resource depletion that it brings. And yet, we are expanding our scientific knowledge. We have the rise of human awareness, and partly because of all of these information sharing technologies like we're doing here today in Split. So I see the complete collapse of the global casino. And of course, the last few days, we have seen yet another scandal, the manipulating of the LIBOR interest rates. And we realize that this game is pretty much over. And in fact, the financialization of this fiat money was really the biggest bubble of all. And so now we have unrepayable debt levels, real interest rates at zero, money printing, we see it on television now. Then we also have currency trading, $4 trillion a day exchanging hands, high frequency trading, where we used to buy shares of companies on the stock market to hold them for a year or 2 years if we cared about the fundamentals. Now it's just holding the shares for a few thousandths of a second. And so this is completely insane. I have just reviewed 2 books on a website that comes out of London that's watched by about 1 million traders every day. And there's 2 books. One is called Broken Market, and the other is called Dark Pools. And these 2 books I recommend very highly. You can find them on that website or on our website. And so we now have derivatives of almost 700 trillion of notional positions versus a global GDP which is only about 65 trillion. So we realize now that this does not compute, and it never will, and the debts are going to have to be written off, and it just is a matter of who is going to take the haircut. That's the fight now between the bondholders and the sovereign governments and the taxpayers. So meanwhile, our company, Ethical Markets, has been really seeing to what extent we can shift all the malinvestments that are going on stock exchanges, FTSE indicators and all of that, and shift those to the green economy. Because I agree with many of my friends that there's really nothing wrong with printing money as long as you're not using it to bail out the past mistakes and protect stupid bankers. And instead, if you're using it to invest in a more permanent green type of economy. So we at Ethical Markets cover this green transition, and we track the private sector investments, and up to now, since 2007, it's 3.3 trillion is already in the pipeline from private investors. And we cover renewable energy, green buildings and efficiency, smart grid, clean technology, and corporate R&D. And we specifically exclude nuclear energy, which is far too expensive and not at all sustainable, as well as coal and the efforts to sequester carbon from coal, which is self-defeating because it cuts the energy efficiency of the electricity plant by about 40%. And also, we do not include agriculturally based biofuels because all they do is drive up the price of food, and we think that the future is in electric transportation anyway, rather than replacing internal combustion engines. So we have concentrated on what we call the Transforming Finance Initiative, and we hope that you will join the 80 or so world-class expert signers we have to our statement, which is there on that website, transformingfinance.net. And what we basically said is that the financial system is part of the global commons. We all need financial services. but we need them to go back to being local and honest and plain vanilla, where local banks take depositors' money and find good local enterprises. The global level can be rebuilt at some point, but right now it's important for us to break up the too big to fail banks. And if they're too big to fail, the answer is small is beautiful, as one of my mentors, E.F. Schumacher, used to say in his book by that same name. So the transition, what are the best safety nets? Well, we're all doing swaps and barter in all kinds of ways at all levels. Local exchange, trading systems on laptops, complementary currencies of one type or another, which Bernard Liessier has a new book out on this. Excellent reading. Time banking, which is really a way of exchanging services between groups. All of these kind of systems require community, because all currencies are based on trust, as you know. And this is just the same with the new currency, the alternative currency. We have to know our neighbors, and we have to know who it is we're dealing with. And so what we see is these localized homegrown economies and the homegrown credit systems, cooperatives. This is the year, the International Year of Cooperatives. And many more people in the world are serviced by cooperatives than by for-profit corporations, something we need to remember. And community credit unions are very important for right now. And microloans, of course, and the new internet-based portals that do crowdfunding that our colleague Lena, who's there with you, can tell you more about. Hello, Lena. So, what's really interesting and indicative of the changing paradigm is the explosion of new indicators. And everybody realized from way back that GDP was not capturing what was really going on and not measuring the progress of countries. So the big change began really in 1975 in Canada. And we here in Florida, in the city of Jacksonville since 1985, have been looking at quality of life, many different indicators, not just money denominated. And so on it went. And by 2000, I and the Calvert Group of Socially Responsible Investing, we developed the Calvert-Henderson Quality of Life Indicators, which there again did not use macroeconomics. We had 12 indicators of quality of life, and we used a multidisciplinary approach, not just trying to turn everything into money coefficients. And then when I was in Brazil in 2003, after President Lula became elected, we put on the International Conference on New Indicators of Sustainability, and that became a basis for Brazil to go to the IMF and say, hey, you've really got to correct these GDP indicators, because they don't have an asset side, the balance sheet. So they make countries look incredibly indebted because they're not carrying the valuable assets which were produced from those public investments, which would cancel out a lot of the debt. So as you know, the Brazilian economy has moved forward very rapidly under President Lula and continues to do today. And then the Canadians started their Index of Well-Being, which I'm honored to be an advisor to. And then the conference where I met your colleagues here and at the European Parliament. And since then, we've had many more, and the very latest one was issued by the United Nations called the Inclusive Wealth Index just a few days ago. So you can find more of that on our website and go into the details. But meanwhile, we are thinking, are we not, about redesigning money. And the first thing we all agree, I think, is that acknowledging that money is not wealth. Money is a metric. It's information. And so what we really need to do is to end the fractional reserve banking system, which allowed private banks to create money practically out of thin air through lending. And I think that many of us believe that national governments have to go back to issuing the money and spending it directly into their economies without interest. And at the same time, that public banks at all levels of the society should have 100% capital reserve so that they can play games and all of these trading nonsense which got the big banks into trouble. Like we've found now that JP Morgan Chase, with their trader in London, supposedly lost $2 billion. Well, guess what? It's now up to $9 billion. And so we can't allow this kind of thing. And so we really have to go back to right after the Great Depression, where we separated retail banks from the more speculative investment banking. Fine, we don't mind having hedge funds and private equity and investment banking, but they have to have the skin in the game, and they have to lose if they make mistakes, not bring the taxpayers into it. So I've always thought there should be 4 levels of money, and all backed by goods and services and renewably generated electricity, which is the main focus of our meeting here. And so global trade, the IMF can continue with special drawing rights of one kind or another. We can't go on using the US dollar as the global reserve currency for obvious reasons. And then it's fine to have national currencies. And of course, this is what Greece is debating right now. And then regional and city currencies. For example, in Brazil, there are 200 small cities in Brazil that have their own local currencies, authorized by the Brazilian central bank. This takes heat off the national currency, and why not let small cities clear their own markets and match their own needs and resources to their own employment and population. And then, of course, community currencies at the very local level and credit systems for communities, as well as all these new ways of doing things, crowdfunding. We have a page now on ethicalmarkets.com covering the big debate that's going on now about crowdfunding, peer-to-peer lending programs, all of that kind of thing done on the internet. So, to capitulate, the redesign revolution is from scarcity, given by the economic model, to abundance. All those free photons coming in every day. And yes, we do have to invest to learn how to collect them a little bit more efficiently than nature does in green leaves, but basically after that, of course, the fuel is free. And the nice thing about a redesign revolution is everybody can and must contribute. And so we're getting new governance forms, more participatory democracies, the new currencies, the transition towns, all of this new stuff. Ecological agriculture, farmers markets, like in our town here in Florida. We have, a thriving farmers market because we are surrounded here by small farms producing vegetables and fruit. We like to have them fresh. And eco-designed products, and basically the idea of biomimicry, a very influential book which was written in the 1990s by my partner and colleague now, Janine Benyon. And this is innovating based on really understanding how nature has innovated successfully over the last 3.8 billion years. And so basically we're talking here about developing countries leapfrogging over the old industrial design and going straight to the solar age. So thank you so much. I hope we have time for some questions. And again, my greetings to everybody. I hope everybody's having a wonderful time, and I look forward to getting the proceedings from this conference a little bit later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hazel, for your presentation and giving some perspectives. I've been struck by many things, but one thing is mentioning word is that $3.3 trillion of investments in green activities, I would say, investment. This is, I think, a real perspective for what not expected 5 or 10 years ago. This is something very significant. Well, there are many other things to say, but thank you again. And I open now the floor. Let's start with questions to Hazel, if you don't mind. So, let's go with the first question. There's someone. So, we hand over the mic, then the question comes. Someone on service? If you need a mic. So we get more light.
Hello, Hazel. This is Jeff Beller.
Can you give your name?
This is Jeff Beller. We met about 6 months ago in Florida.
Hi.
How are you? What I'm curious to know is, you made it very clear that we have to change the GDP to include the love economy. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
And
it is happening now. I mean, there's so many of these new versions, and so it's being done. And we need to watch all of these new efforts. The one I like quite a lot, apart from the Canadian one, which is the Canadian Index of Well-Being, the new one put out by the OECD in Paris is called the Better Life Index. But basically, they are all multidisciplinary. They're not based on macroeconomics. They're based on the real world. And this makes them already a lot better. I mean, you know, where the economics failed, of course, was it never considered energy as an independent variable. They always had energy nested under land or under capital. And of course, you have to consider energy as a separate variable because it's the basis of the whole thing.
And the other thing is, you mentioned pegging energy to a currency.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Well, the thing is that there's still a lot of retroactive sort of discussion about the gold standard. Particularly in this country, there's a lot of very conservative old money managers are saying, well, we just have to go back to the gold standard. Well, that would recapitulate all the mistakes of the Great Depression. And we don't need to do that again. And so to the extent that we need a reference value in the real world, a kilowatt hour electricity-based reference is better than anything else I can think of. There was a lot of discussion about baskets of currencies. Chinese are considering, they fix their currency now to a basket of other currencies. And then there's a lot of discussion of the basket of commodities. But the whole problem with those things are that they're very difficult, really. You have all of the issues of storage. And so basically, what I like about the kilowatt hour basis, particularly, of course, generated by renewable energy, is that it's so clear, you know, a kilowatt hour is always a kilowatt hour, and no government can print them. They're hooked into the real world. And for example, what's happening in Greece now, I know there's quite a little discussion going on about generating from their abundant solar energy resources electricity to feed into the European electric grid, which would be one way of meeting some of their debt obligations. So it's a lot more realistic. And also in the case of Iceland, if you remember when Iceland defaulted basically its banks defrauded all of those borrowers from the Netherlands and Britain. And it would have been perfectly feasible for them to generate electricity from their abundant geothermal resources and pipe it into the electric grid and pay off their debt that way. Now, I'm very sympathetic with the Icelandic people. What they decided to do was, hey, no, we didn't incur these debts. It was our stupid private banks. Our government was stupid enough to bail them out. We do not consider these debts anything to do with us. And they rejected the whole idea, as they had a perfect democratic right to do. We'd rather go back to being a little country with fishing and knitting sweaters. So, you know, countries have the right to make kind of decision.
Okay.
But to the extent that you could do a value basis for currency, I have to believe that kilowatt hours are the best thing to do.
Okay. The next question, please.
Hazel, would you agree that...
Your name first.
Shan Turnbull, Hazel, but I'm not allowed to say anything else because I've been
I've
been a ruthless moderator here and wouldn't let questioners ask any other things. So my one sentence question, as an example, as a ruthless moderator, is how would you agree that the solar age money should not be used as a store of value and have the ability to earn interest?
Yes, but I defer to Shan Turnbull on this issue of kilowatt-hour-based currencies because Shan is really the big innovator in this area, and I've been quoting Shan's papers on kilowatt-hour currencies for many, many years. so I agree with you very much, Shan, because I think that interest-based currencies and using currencies as store of value gets us away from the real world and gets us into the kind of manipulation that we have gotten into. And I would agree with Professor Margaret Kennedy that interest is always the big problem. And I don't see any reason at all why governments can't spend money into an economy interest-free. And because this would help us to understand that money is not wealth. Money still is always a metric, and it's an information system tracking the real wealth, which is the creativity and talent and energy of entrepreneurial individuals, and mixed with the planetary resources and all those free photons and all the energy of the Earth.
Okay. So please, another question to you. Yeah, please.
Hi, Hazel. Great to hear you. This is Ellen Brown.
Hi, Ellen!
We're the same.
Wow, I thought you were coming in on video.
Oh, no.
Wow.
I thought that was a really fascinating concept about the capital account, that you could balance out the debt with the thing you bought with it. But I don't understand exactly how that would work. I mean, I could see if it was a building, and maybe corporations count buildings on the other, I don't know how they do the balance sheets. But what would you do with things like Social Security and medical things, or what do you count on the other side that would balance out your debt? I'm just trying to picture a balance sheet that did that.
Yeah, well, if you look at the social spending, whatever it's for, a lot of it is investing in human capital. I mean, like when you invest in the education of a student, this is not an expense. In GDP, it's considered an expense, like buying ice cream or throwing it in the street, wasting it. If you realize that investing in our children's education is the most important investment that society makes. The same thing about health. there are ways of measuring the positive value of healthy, educated citizens. But when you realize that the era of GDP, which is still true all over the world, and I've been crusading on this for decades, you know, talking to my friends in the Japanese government, where they keep on being told by Western economists, oh my gosh, you know, you're broke, you've got this huge debt to GDP ratio. And I'm saying, okay, but look at the fabulous infrastructure you have. Look at the highly educated population. Look at the beautiful productive ecosystem. Look at all of the geothermal energy resources that you're sitting on. And if you add these on the other side of the balance sheet, you can cut your debt down, way down, and simply declare victory. And so it's true also with Ireland. I was doing some seminars in Belfast a couple of weeks ago, and the Irish people, they got into exactly the same problem with GDP, because their sovereign bonds, all those bond traders, look at one thing, the debt to GDP ratio. And so they decide, oh, well, you know, they would have to sell off the Irish bonds because, you know, they don't have any GDP growth and blah, blah, blah. And so if you don't realize that you need to add into the balance sheet the fact that Ireland has a highly educated population, it has wonderful infrastructure, public infrastructure paid for by taxpayers, and it has highly productive natural ecosystems. And if all of those were properly put on the balance sheet, Irish debt would look like a pretty good deal. So this is how important it is to get this right.
Okay, perhaps, yeah, well, first question before.
Hi.
Well, okay.
Hazel, John Mayer. Sorry. Over here. Okay. Micro. Okay. Hi, John Mayer. Delighted to hear you boost the kilowatt hour. That's what we'll be talking about tomorrow.
No, here. And your name first. The microphone. Just a minute.
Start again? Okay. Okay, Hazel, it's
Your name?
John Mayer.
Okay.
And I'll be speaking on kilowatt hour tomorrow, so delighted to hear you promoting it. You mentioned, you made a distinct mention of solar power. Moving to solar power, and I agree this is where we have to go, but the energy return on investment is going to be vastly lower with that than it is currently with our fossil fuels. And I'm wondering how you think we will adjust to that new paradigm where energy may be available, but we'll have to work a lot harder for it.
Yes, I think the energy return on energy investment is finally creeping into the asset managers of the pension funds, and they're beginning to realize, you know, that they have a lot of stranded assets, actually, subprime assets. Right now, 40% of the assets on the FTSE 100 are fossil fuel reserves that probably never can be brought up to the surface because of climate change. And so the big thing about fossil fuels, as we all know, is that they give you a really big bang for the buck and allow enormously large systems to develop. And what will happen, I think, as we use a suite of different energy, renewable energy sources, which are appropriate to each country, is particularly true in developing countries where they can never afford to build nuclear plants. They can never afford big centralized coal plants and oil plants and huge transmission lines. That's really the 19th and 20th century. But instead, they will have to have more decentralized systems and much more locally generated resources, whether it's rooftop solar, local wind generators, wave power and ocean currents. using low-head hydro in their rivers, so on and so forth. So it says to me that these energy systems will be more decentralized, and the good thing about that is they are much more democratic. They allow a lot more people to be involved in their design. I remember once doing a debate when I was a policy wonk in Washington at the Office of Technology Assessment, and I did a debate with one of our nuclear gurus, Dr. Alvin Weinberg, it was at the Tennessee Valley Nuclear Authority in Tennessee. And I was asking Dr. Weinberg about whether he didn't think that nuclear power was actually unconstitutional, because there was no way of even members of Congress understanding how nuclear power actually works, and what to do, of course, with all of these high-level wastes and so on and so forth. So basically, the more centralized and higher sort of energy bang for the buck you get at the front end, like with a nuclear power plant, the worse you are in terms of democratic participation and in terms of effect on the environment and health further down the line. So I'm looking forward to the day when we have more decentralized and local diverse energy supply.
Okay, thank you. A last question to you, Ethan, but also to the other contributors and panelists here next on the floor. In one of your last slides, you mentioned in the process of coming the participatory democracy. So this is fine. I do agree with that. However, looking at that, the problem of our crisis, do the populations understand what is going on? That's the first thing. Do the populations have sufficient correct information, which is highly doubtful? And so is it not demanding too much of people to express their mind and their feelings on the risk of being completely wrong or biased? So I want to have your impression on that. And I shift the same question to my two colleagues here at my left. So please, yours first.
This is a very important question, and it really is, it points to the need for this whole system redesign. In other words, we have to look at mass media and how information is transmitted to the general public. And I would totally agree with you that we cannot run more participatory and democratic societies without more education and more availability of education. And so this means that the education establishments all around the world will have to change. And education will have to be free and online, as it is, for example, with Khan Academy, which was started by a Pakistani student who was helping his little sister with her calculus. And he began to write little study plans for her on YouTube. And so right now, Khan Academy goes all around the world and helps students if they don't get enough attention from a teacher. Now, so what I think is that most of the bricks and mortar academies of the centuries are really dinosaurs. And that public education really needs to be a public good, like it is in China. And that's why the Chinese are graduating so many PhDs all over the place, millions of them. And so mostly I think it's going to have to be accessible online. And then mass media have to be reformed, particularly in the West, where mass media has been mostly commercial and funded by the advertising from basically the fossil fuel age industry. which of course includes pharmaceuticals and agricultural chemicals. I mean, almost everything is energized by fossil fuels. And so they own the airwaves and the content. And that's really why I started my company, Ethical Markets Media, because back in 2004, because I realized that there would be no way that the mass media in the US, completely controlled by the fossil fuel and nuclear power industry, would ever allow the story of that 3.3 trillion private investors investing in solar, wind, and all of the renewable energy. So that those two revolutions are underway thanks to the internet. And most people now are moving away from watching national television in the US, and they get their news online. And even though it's incredibly difficult to figure out who to believe and who to trust, I trust ordinary people in their own communities to figure out a lot of these things for themselves. And when you look at some of the media focus, and we have a lot of videos that we have done and put up on this, like in these transition camps, where the city itself has realized, okay, we are going to have to take charge of our education, of our media resources, to put up our own wind generators and solar panels. And a lot of communities are doing this now. And this is part of citizen education, I think, for this kind of more decentralized future.
Okay, fine. So, perhaps
I think there is quite a lot of a need to explain why certain crises came about. This is one very important explication why things happen like this. The second point is there should be discussed alternative solutions for small and larger problems with the people which are concerned immediately. I think the politicians and the scientists do not fulfill these activities sufficiently. Second point, we have one promising activity just recently in the European Parliament. Under the heading, we go to the citizens. Parliamentarians are very often just traveling around in Europe and speaking small talks, mainly with the population. So they want to change now the dialogue with the concerned people as the parliamentarians. This is one side, but one should not be too hopeful in this respect.
Yes.
Well, I do think it's a problem, like with corporations. Corporations are owned by the shareholders theoretically, and they get to vote. But virtually all shareholders just either hand over their proxies to someone else or don't vote at all because they don't care. So if you in fact had a system where everybody got to vote on every issue, it would be like corporations where it's only the really interested people who would vote, and they would be the ones with a personal interest, and you would be allowed to come up with something that's not the most fair thing for everyone. So it is a problem. What I would envision, but I mean this isn't my field of expertise, but I've tried to think this through myself. What I would envision would be something where you do have sort of your local group, you would vote on things, you would come up with a consensus in your group. So these are people you know, you talk about it, and then, so maybe have sort of a group vote among people who have discussed it, and you can see what's going on, you can see who's biased, whatever, So start from the grassroots and have your votes go up, but do it in a sort of in a stepwise thing, rather than having a million people vote on one issue and then you just take the result.
Okay. So we are in the end of our session. So one thing is sure, it will take some time to get the maturity of all of us all together as societies. I hope that it will happen in time. So I thank you very much, Isla, for your participation. Out down from or far from Florida to be here with us at the Adriatic region. Thank you very much once again. I hope that another occasion will come up sometime. Also, thanks for the brilliant contributions. So you escaped questions. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
And the technician.
Okay.
Okay. So someone takes over. So thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Hazel.